Hi, and welcome to AXSchat. We're delighted to have Florence Chapman with us, who's the CEO of SenseAbility. SenseAbility is based in Canada and is working with the business community to further accessibility and inclusion. Welcome, Florence. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing?
Thanks very much, Neil. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, your time. Canadian Business SenseAbility, or SenseAbility as we come to be known, is an organization that was developed out of a document in 2013 entitled Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector. And at that time, the federal government contacts had decided to commission a report that suggested that the business community really had a large role to play in advancing the employment outcomes for people with disabilities. That people with disabilities was an underemployed and unemployed, marginalized group of individuals, and a talent pool that was not seeing the employment outcomes that were needed. And a group of business leaders published the report. It became an important document in Canada, which really started to elevate the discussion on accessibility and inclusion and that business role. The organization really started to come together, and in an operating sense, in 2014, sort of late 2014, we had to develop our infrastructure, a website, decide what our business approach would be to getting businesses connected and educated and committed to disability inclusion initiatives. And what we found was that organizations were really at the start of this process, that inclusion and diversity was starting to be a very big talking point, but it was very much a categorized approach, very much sort of women, LGBTQ, Indigenous populations, cultural diversity, and disability inclusion was something kind of off to the side. And therefore, the commitment and the budgeting, for example, to expand these initiatives was really very limited. So that was one barrier. Plus the notion that it's a fragmented service provider organizational situation here in Canada, where there wasn't really a coordinated system or pathway for recruitment. So employers were finding a frustration in that they had to seek out multiple service advisors or employment agencies to find that talent, yet they weren't really ready within their organizations to onboard and welcome individuals with disabilities. So that's how it all started. So we started to build our approach. And you mentioned Business Disability Forum, a great organization, and we are very much operating in a similar way, a membership-based organization. And we've expanded to actually really start to work with those service providers, with public service organizations, and with academic institutions, because what we're finding is the landscape really requires examining the bigger picture of all the stakeholders that need to be involved in advancing employment outcomes for people with disabilities. We just to give you a little bit more context,
Yes.
in the last couple of years, we've grown to about 20 memberships. We're a member-based organization.
Okay.
And what we're finding is that our members and organizations that we're reaching out to are now very much more committed to welcoming individuals with disabilities, for the innovation, the diverse perspectives that are brought to the entire organization, and of course towards that very important notion of starting to create products and services that are reflective of the consumer market of people with disabilities, which is very large, very substantial, and growing. And there's been a lot of research about that over the last couple of years. One of the experts with which we very much have referred to is Rich Donovan in the Return on Disability group.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm familiar with Rich. Interestingly, he's quoting something like $1.3 trillion as the size of the market. Gartner, who are not specialist disability analysts, actually quote market size as 8 trillion. So if you're in the IT business, lots of large company bosses pay attention to Gartner
Yes.
in terms of their, they base their research on what they're going to buy and what trends they're going to follow upon these analyst houses. So the fact that the analyst houses are making these proclamations about the enormous size of the market is a positive, and I think that it will see engagement at higher levels. So let's break down a couple, because you raised quite a lot of points all in one go there. So you were talking about innovation. So let's look at the innovation point first. So we often talk about people with disabilities bringing innovation into organizations. Do you have any examples amongst your membership of where the increase in employment of people with disabilities is actually helping them be more innovative?
Yes, and in fact, some of the organizations that we work with, particularly some of the larger banks, which are now operating on a global basis, they have very much committed to bringing in individuals to not just ideate the consumer user experience pathway, but of course, in terms of digital labs and accessibility departments, which are committed to changing, innovating for software changes within the organizations, and of course internally, but also externally. So they're implementing adaptable technologies that are customer facing, but also thinking about the employee user experience, and how better to make the ability to onboard and to advance individuals and to elevate their productivity by offering adaptive technologies that are seamless, that are easily accessed through a centralized accommodations or adjustment process, as we like to call it. So, these diverse perspectives are also coming towards building inclusive design thinking departments, which is really amazing, because this is how our organization has approached all of the learning platforms, the training, the outreach that we have to our members, is to think about those design elements for the edges, and how, when we start thinking a much more bigger picture for designing, that we are of course adapting much better products and services for all of us. And so what I'm seeing is appointments, even internally at some of these large organizations, towards an inclusive design thinking executive leader, or someone that's now responsible for this bigger notion, and then of course trying to include accessibility throughout different operating units. So it's becoming very apparent to us. A couple of organizations, for example, to mention is TD Bank, for example, Royal Bank of Canada. They're definitely committed and taking a leadership position there. And I've often said to members in some of our events or in discussions that it would be great to see a chief accessibility officer or a chief inclusive design thinking executive or officer kind of really being planted and committed to at that senior level. So I think we're heading there, and we've got some great leaders in that space. For example, OCAD University in Toronto, and the Inclusive Research Design Center in Toronto. So that really advancing those notions in the public sector with our municipal governments and our provincial governments, but also at the corporate level. So it's very exciting.
Okay.
That's a long-term process.
That's okay though.
No, you are currently working with business, but one of the questions that we frequently see coming as a barrier, and in some of regions around the world, is some business they struggle to find a way to onboard employees with disabilities. Sometimes they don't really understand the process, or they are not prepared for that. What type of work are you doing with your members to facilitate the onboarding process and the recruitment of employees with disabilities?
So we work with organizations in this particular area by examining all the pathways to which individuals can, for example, apply to the organization. Once they apply, what is the interview process? All the stages. What is the that next step once they're offered the position. Where's the pathway to onboarding, and then where's the pathway to advancement, and of course retention. So it's a long pathway, but how do we integrate with the best practices that are going to be a seamless experience for that individual? One big barrier that we found is that certainly from the website, aspect, and even backing it up further, it's that individual that's applying into a system. So for example, an applicant tracking system, which of course may present a huge barrier because there are certain keywords or job experience, or they may have job gaps in their resume, which won't allow them to get through these large applicant tracking systems and algorithms. So what are those alternative means by which individuals can contact the company, can have an opportunity to make that connection with the recruiter or recruiting manager? And so we're encouraging organizations to create those alternative pathways, which some of them are doing very effectively. But once that individual, and then of course, making sure that the interviewers and the hiring managers are very much understand what is required in that process, the kind of questions to ask, what's needed in order to make that interview the best possible experience for the applicant, and of course the most effective as well for the hiring manager. And so those best practices in place where there's a comfort level that they've addressed, made the process easier for the individual. And that can be not asking barriered questions, making sure that the environment or the space in advance is prepared for the individual to be their best selves, to be able to communicate on their terms and on their levels, to communicate their abilities. Breaking down some of the organizational ways or notions of traditional hiring practices, the school experience, the sort of job experience that has to be laid out year after year without any breaks. So looking for really the skills and for the talent that are going to match that opportunity, and getting those job postings to look more like a way to attract the specific skills, not to attract a massive resume, which really can often be a barrier to individuals applying. We also find that even backing it up a little further with the job applicant, that often there's a difficulty in disclosure. So disclosure is always a big talking point for many of our corporate members. They want to understand how can they encourage disclosure in the right ways once your individuals come on board. They want to be able to understand how, when, and why the applicant may or may choose not to disclose, and what that may mean for them. Because employers really do need more information in order to provide that productivity change or adaptation for individuals that may need it. So disclosure is one of those very big talking points. Once
it's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's a huge topic, because there's this conflict between disclosing so that you get the adjustments made that you need to be able to shine in both the interview and the job should you pass the interview,
right,
and the fear that through disclosing you won't get to the interview. So there's the duality of the situation is that you have to create a sense of trust, even between the applicant and the organization that's recruiting, and that's quite difficult to do. So that, I think that's a long-term reputational piece of work that people and organizations need to do in that space, because it is very hard, especially when we're talking about people with hidden disabilities.
Oh,
because
I agree.
It's obvious when someone uses a white stick or has a wheelchair. Okay, you don't see that on the CV, and that hopefully won't, it's not something you need to necessarily put that will get through the initial sift, but it is obvious when you turn up for interviews. So, but it might not be obvious that someone is autistic, and this was a big topic today, actually, and I want to return back to the whole thing about logarithms. algorithms, because this is a real area where people are innovating in HR, but at the same time, because yes, it's burdensome going through CVs and it's burdensome going through the attraction process and so on and so forth.
Right.
But we're really running the risk right now of actually slicing down and narrowing down the diversity of companies through these algorithms and automatic sifting processes, because bias in, bias out.
That's right.
So I think it was really interesting. We were seeing some discussions on Twitter just today, where one of our regulars on AXSchat, Anna, was talking about the fact that there's going to be some remote screening software which is all about video interviewing, and then they're looking at people's body language and all of this kind of stuff. Well, again, you're going to screen out a whole bunch of neurodiverse people through doing that. That you're likely to then at some point adversely impact the performance of your company because you've selected for homogeneity. But I can see how it's convenient, and people like to recruit like people. There's less tension in that. So what are your organization and some of your members doing to combat that? You said you've got various different pathways in. Are there specific sort of education campaigns and things you're working on?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, these kinds of pathways are very much being looked at and used within some of our member organizations, and they would involve things like direct outreach to campuses where there's specific events or coordinated speed networking events where the managers within these corporations or businesses come on campus. It's a specific event for students with disabilities to talk about opportunities within the company, to talk about what these roles really require, and to have managers exposed to individuals with different talents. And it works very well. There's also different means by which applicants can contact the organization. So, for example, RBC has done a great job in direct pathways, direct contacts that are responsible for just welcoming conversations on job applications, as opposed to strictly having them individuals apply into the system without into the large pool. So there is ability for applicants to have those direct contacts, and we encourage that because what we're finding is that these organizations are trying to build some trust, and they do want the diverse perspectives of talented individuals, and so they are making these efforts to manage that kind of applicant system in order to create that. So I think there's a dual approach, that there is the broader pool of tracking systems, but there is also an interest to figure out a much better way to do this. And I think you mentioned that businesses need to build that trust, and in working with the universities and co-op offices, accessibility offices, counseling offices, we're really hopeful that we're building a network of public and private sector organizations that are elevating that notion of trust, because they're actually really committed to this, and we can now direct those applicants to these organizations. So we're saying that you're committed, we're working with you. It's very visible on our website who those member corporations or organizations are, and we're saying to universities or colleges, they are committed to welcoming you into the organization, or to at least start that conversation with some alternative ways for you to have that conversation. So very important. The other thing that we're doing is we have got commitments from many of our members to create experiential or work integrated learning opportunities that are specific to individuals in say the college or university system, where they may perhaps be excluded or barriered from reaching a co-op program, or perhaps entering a certain program. Our members are committed to having some of those experiences open to a direct pathway for those students. So that's really key, because we're now digging deeper to try to develop those conversations and that experience building for those individuals, so that there may be a much better longer term outcome for them in the labor market.
And I think that's a real key there. You mentioned long term,
Yes.
because it's all very well to find short jobs and bits and pieces of contract work, but what we really want is, you know, a good long-term career path for people, prospects where they, you know, they're going to stay in employment and not just hop from one dead-end job to another.
Yeah,
So,
and I think our student population, you know, we've got these future leaders, and I'm going to give you one example of great future leader initiative. We are a board member of what's called Access to Success, which is an MBA student-led coalition at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and they had started a very big program, an actual not-for-profit, which is going to bring attention across Canada to MBA schools in terms of leadership in accessibility, inclusion, and universal design thinking, because what their idea is that the graduates of those programs will then be in a position to influence at the corporate level or at the business level or at the entrepreneurial level when they start their own pathways in the labor market. So these are, and there's pockets of these kinds of initiatives which I think are really important for this next generation, being committed to moving the notion that talents of all abilities.
And that work that you are doing with universities, they are focused on a particular area of studies, or they are broader than that, and they include people from the, you know, from who are studying law, finance, economics. How is that working?
Well, at this right now, what we have been involved in developing this fellowship mentorship program for the MBA students is geared towards those business students, and they may be following other academic pathways, but those business students are really entering fields which can be startups, can be technology, can be public service, you know, policy, global policy. So where they decide to take their and end up working within organizations is really exciting, because I think there will be a broad reach, but these students are making a commitment to accessibility and universal design, and moving that through schools across Canada and eventually into the United States. So this is kind of an interesting initiative, which is student-led, and we see other opportunities. For example, at McGill University, an undergraduate student-led conference that's been put on every year, which brings corporate leaders together with students with disabilities, and towards kind of elevating the dialogue, elevating the discussion. And these students at what's called Empower McGill through the McGill University have also been reaching broadly. They started this a couple of years ago and are very intent on maintaining that legacy forward for students. And I think these are things that are moving ahead. We've also been involved in discussions with the university co-op counseling organizations, CAFKI, which and CWIL, which we've had discussions, webinars across Canada on disclosure, for example, and what it means from the student perspective, what it means from the business perspective, and how do we create the integration and platform so that these experiences can be much more successful.
I used to spend quite a lot of time serving the student market in a previous job. Okay. And one of the things that I think was interesting was that we would see very good levels of disclosure in the student population, and despite there being funding available for assistive technology for people in the workplace, the people would be out and disclose as students, but would then effectively go back in the closet and not disclose when they were coming into the workforce. So how do we begin to address some of those issues of confidence, and what do you think are the differences between what is it that makes it okay for people to feel safe disclosing in an education environment but not in an employment environment?
Yeah, I think one of the perhaps barriers to start with, certainly from my observation, has been that there hasn't been enough coordination between, say, the co-op office, the counseling office, and the accessibility office. They seem to have often worked in silos. There should be a little bit more integration about a much better platform or plan or resources for students to understand how, why, when to disclose to that employer. But there also there has to be much more education at those academic levels. And I think throughout the entire academic system, that this has to be elevated and prioritized. Accessibility inclusion should be thought of as really something that touches universally within the organization. From the business standpoint, I think there's still much more work to do in helping businesses and organizations understand what questions can we ask, how can we make this experience much more successful? Are we prepared internally? So we've got these two big pieces that have to come together, and that's kind of what SenseAbility has been working towards. We're working at both ends because we recognize that you can't deal with employer education and buy-in yet not sort of look at the other side and what that disclosure piece is doing to prevent successful employment outcomes. So it's really kind of working right throughout. And then, of course, as I mentioned, another piece is the employment service providers that really also play a part in those pathways and the discussions for disclosure.
If we go just a little bit back to the conversation of recruitment, is there any numbers that you're able to provide us in terms of retention when you hire people with disabilities? Because we've seen a few interesting numbers in the past, and I would like to see if you have something there that can also help us to put that in perspective.
That's a very good question, and I could probably say that we don't have anything aggregated, but we're starting to try to build some data metrics on what that looks like. Do you have, can you give me some of your experience on that?
Well, certainly we've got case studies from organisations like Business Disability Forum. We know what the average cost of adjustments are across a range of members, and I know what the cost of adjustments are within my own organisation because I'm the one responsible for it. So and that's less. It's around about £500 per user on average across the span of users, which is 1/14 of the cost of the agency fees when you recruit someone through an agency. You know, the average cost of recruiting someone is about £7,000. So obviously there's an incentive to right there to keep people employed. So it's quite clear that, you know, when you provide these adjustments, we're able to retain people longer. We've got some evidence, and I can't give you the figures off the top of my head, about reduced absentee rates. Certainly, length of tenure tends to be longer than for non-disabled members of staff. Now, that's a double-edged sword again, because it might just be that there just aren't that many accessible jobs out there. So people, it might not be that they love their employer so much as we would like to think, but that actually it's harder to be mobile in the job market. So, but there does seem to be good evidence that people do stay long time and that they are loyal, and that a company that makes those adjustments wins over the loyalty of not only the employees with disabilities, but also it has a halo effect on the rest of the business, because they can be seen that they're doing the right thing, that they can be seen to be walking the talk of diversity in the widest sense, not just ticking the box. Yep, gender, tick, you know, race, tick, you know, all of these things, but actually taking a wide view. So lots of benefits. I think that we can always do more. We can always record better data. I think it's quite hard to translate that data across international boundaries because of the way that different countries require either to disclose or not disclose. So the US approach is very, very different to the approach in the UK, and it's again different from the approach in Europe. So in Europe, for instance, you've got quotas, don't have in the UK. So where there are quotas, there's a lot of data recorded about numbers of people. Whereas UK, there's a different approach. There wasn't a requirement in the same way, but equally, I'm somewhat conflicted about quotas.
Yeah, I agree. They don't always result in retention. They may result in you know, a number, a tick box, and then you know, you're really not prepared to see the advancement of that employee.
Yeah, I think that's true. So.
And you know, in Canada and in UK, you have the advantage of having organizations who, you know, are doing the work that you are doing, but that's not something that goes across the European countries. So there's countries where this type of advocacy doesn't exist at all. So it makes it more difficult, even if we have seen a good number of efforts in making things more accessible, and a lot of directives coming from the European Union over the last year. The fact that there are organizations that are able to provide this support for business, it's particularly important.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just going to say, Neil, to your point about the numbers that you mentioned, the sort of less than £500 for the average cost of adjustment. We have similar numbers, less than $500 Canadian for adjustments. And of course, those similar absenteeism numbers and retention statistics. But in terms of retention numbers within these organizations, I mean, there's a lot more to be done about collecting that data. And the other thing is that you know, we want to encourage, or we want to find ways to collect information on disclosure, information on retention, better numbers, so that we can see exactly what's happening with an organization. Because retention is an issue, despite even organizations trying to be more committed to best practices in that regard. So, and what we find, one of the biggest questions still when we go into how much is it going to cost to accommodate? And it's still a question out there, despite the fact that we have messaged immensely about these sort of reference points that you had. The cost is really pretty insignificant. And it's not really that talking point. It's about getting that person to that level of productivity and bringing those best talents. And it doesn't, cost is not the factor there. And so anyway, these are, you know, things that are still developing and ongoing within our sort of environment in Canada.
So I think it's incumbent on us to share the data where we can. I think that it's also always good to look at the long-term retention stuff. Gosh, how do we do that across multiple geographies with different ways of looking at things and different methods of counting? I'm not sure, but I still think it's really, you know, important to do. Maybe Rich and some of the clever quant guys have some kind of calculation that we could look at there. I think that also there is an issue with nervousness on the part of employees. It's not just employers. It's not just the idea of the cost of the accommodation. It's the lack of knowledge of how they address people with disabilities. It's you know, I'm not comfortable with how I'm going to deal with the actual issue of someone's disability itself, but then the sort of concept of disability and the welcoming them into the workplace, the training of the teams. All of these things can be addressed quite easily through education and through outreach. But it's a constant dialogue that we need to be having to make sure that people are comfortable, that they understand that actually it's not really onerous, and that most of these adjustments are quite simple. And indeed, you know, some of the most effective ones are soft adjustments, changes to working practices, you know, the ability to have flexible hours, or to work from home, or to wear noise cancelling headphones. You know, really quite simple stuff that if you didn't couch it in in the language of disability probably would go unnoticed. It's when
Yeah, that's
people
correct.
start framing it around disability that they start to get
The conversation changes.
nervous.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we find. You know, employers are willing to make those adjustments on, you need to have a later pickup or you've got to work from home. But when you start to talk about an accommodation, again, with the term that we like to kind of move away from if we can, it becomes a different mindset and approach and almost barriered, and that's what we're really trying to open up this conversation of a universal concept of better productivity for your employee network, for your talent pool, and how do we provide adjustments for people that are going to need it in general, not just us and them, this kind of notion of people with disabilities versus the rest of the employee group. So it's really about broadening that conversation, the understanding of disability, the attachment to disability. At some point, we're likely to, as we age, to even experience disability, or it really is a universal human part of us. So we're trying to embed these concepts a little bit more. But you've got so many different operating ecosystems and that level of understanding out there that it really is very much a long-term work in progress. And of course, we need to look at large organizations versus SMEs, small, medium enterprises, where there's different approaches to operations and hiring and resources. And so there's a great deal of context-specific approach that has to be had. You have to look at the specific operating environment and deal within that.
Yeah.
So, it's exciting at the same time because there is a great opportunity to keep moving this messaging. And I think from the perspective of a global, how do we share this stuff? Well, maybe we come together more frequently with global organizations, maybe Global Business Disability Network, and maybe we start to get more coordinated on how we're sharing this information to bring those best practices and our learnings across the globe.
Yeah. So we members of the ILO's Global Business and Disability Network, and I think that's one place where all of these member organizations and all of these companies can talk on a global level. So I think it's a good place to start. Antonio, did you want to say something before we close?
And that's why we started AXSchat. We're trying to bring a lot of people together, because we end up trying to, we are talking with you here today. We are talking with people from India last week, and what we found is, by being able to conduct these conversations every week, we end up informally introducing people to each other. People were not aware of each other's existence, so this is something that we actually take a great pleasure in doing.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really it's energizing, and to know that we can be connected globally this way, and to make a difference to other regions and other global partners. I think it's fantastic. So we're happy as well to be involved with GBDN.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Right, well, we've pretty much come to the end of our half hour. So thank you for bearing with us despite the technical glitches. I need to thank Barclays for supporting us and helping us get our captions done in a timely manner, and all of the other support that they give us too. So job done there. So thank you very much, Florence. We look forward to you joining us on Twitter.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.